Hey there, dear listener. Welcome back to the Your Best Story podcast. We're going to talk today about point of view, stance, and distance. And those are three very important subjects to understand when you are writing narrative nonfiction or fiction. But first, an announcement. I'm working hard to piece together a new magazine called The Deliberate Scribe. And I'm working together with a number of other professionals in the Christian writing and editing industry to gather relevant articles and devotionals and all kinds of inspiration so that you, as a nonfiction writer, can become a deliberate scribe, that you can grow in your craft and also learn how to balance the faith element with the craft element. What I wanted to say about that is that this magazine will also be open to submissions from readers and podcast listeners. So if you have anything to say that you think is interesting for other Christian nonfiction writers, then submit an article about it or a devotional or a column or whatever to info@yourbeststory.net. info@yourbeststory.net. I promise to read and respond to every submission. Of course, I cannot promise that any of your submissions will actually land in the magazine, but I promise to read and respond. Okay, so much for the announcement. We are going to talk about POV, point of view, and stance and distance. Well, first POV. What is the point of view exactly? Well, point of view is mostly interesting for fiction writers in its normal meaning. Because it means basically through whose eyes are you seeing the story unfold. It's like you put a camera right beside the eyes of a certain person, a certain character in the story, and you see everything happening as though through his eyes. But it's not only visible, of course, as a writer, you have all the senses at your exposure. So you can use touch, you can use smell, you can use taste, you can use all of the senses. Whereas with a camera, you are limited to only vision and sound. Within nonfiction, this definition of point of view is only relevant when you are writing scenes. So only relevant for scenic narrative nonfiction. But if you use it either in fiction or in nonfiction, it is crucial to know what you're doing. Actually, you cannot write a scene without using some sort of point of view. You have to decide on the point of view. And if you don't know well how point of view works, then you get into trouble. Here's what Saul Stein says about it in his book, How to Grow a Novel. Handling point of view is like skating on ice. When it goes well, it's an intricate dance, beautifully performed. When the point of view shifts without the writer being aware of it, the thin ice cracks. The reader doesn't know anything about point of view. He knows only that the dance seems momentarily out of control. If the slippage continues, the reader may put the book down and pick up another book. So that's what's at stake. If the point of view confuses your reader, if it is not clear through whose eyes exactly you're looking at the story, and it hops from this eye to the other, from this person to another person, if there's no consistent point of view, you will get confused and start looking for another book. And this is not only something that happens with novice writers or so. Saul Stein continues to say, I can't recall a manuscript by a professional writer that didn't have a couple of glitches in the handling of point of view. Sometimes dozens. So it doesn't matter how experienced you are, point of view is something you always have to have. Not in the back of your mind, but really at the front. You must always be thinking about it. What is my point of view? Through whose eyes am I looking at this? And by extension, what is the stance and the distance, which can mean a few things, and we are going to talk about that a bit more later. It is obvious then that for exposition, point of view doesn't mean the same thing. For exposition, the point of view is actually limited to the way the author views the subject or the topic that he's writing about. So it has more to do with the slant, with the opinions, the thesis that the author has in exposition. Because exposition is, of course, more of the explanatory kind of nonfiction. You cannot put a camera on it because there's nothing to see. It deals with theory rather than active scenes. So and that is where exposition and narrative in nonfiction really differ. Narrative nonfiction tells a story and exposition explains ideas. So in exposition, there are no eyes to look through because there is no real story that's being told, not in the sense of how we experience a story. But of course, also in exposition, you might want to break the stream of ideas now and then by using an anecdote, by using a scene, a case, a vignette, something that is actually filmable. And that is the difference. If you can put a camera on it and in real time follow the story along, then you are talking about scenic narrative. And sometimes using scenic narrative to break the dry material of the exposition can be very useful. And if you decide to do that, you're going to have to make a few choices about point of view, stance and distance as well. So this is relevant for every kind of writer who ever uses any kind of narrative. So you need to choose a person through whose eyes you are going to look at the story. It's like placing a little GoPro camera beside the eyes of a viewpoint character, or even implement it into the eyes, but that sounds somewhat painful. Anyway, you're seeing exactly what the viewpoint character is seeing if you stay very close to your viewpoint character. And if you've read any book on fiction writing and point of view, you'll know that the person who is most influenced by the story usually should be the viewpoint character. Because that is the person whose life is being changed because of it. And the idea of story is, of course, how a person changes through a certain sequence of events. But in nonfiction, this is a bit more difficult because the person most influenced might not be the person who has experienced the story from beginning to end. It might be that the person who is most influenced by the story was only part of a snippet of it, part of one short scene. I must think of, for example, a scene in which a fight erupts somewhere in the city, and the one who is most influenced by it is the person who gets a terrible concussion and then has his life ruined basically by some sort of brain damage or something. It happens, that sort of stuff. This person may have been only part of the sequence of events for the particular moment that the fighting was going on. He just happened to be caught in the middle of it, and after that short fight sequence, he was raced off to the hospital, and there his part of the story ends. So it began only a few minutes before it ended. Whereas the entire story might be involving the whole background of why this fight erupted to begin with. This fight might be only a tiny part of a long story of two groups that have been at war with each other for years already, or something like that. I'm just making this stuff up now, okay? It is then a mistake to take this person whose life might be ruined because of this fight as the viewpoint character, because this viewpoint character came into the story only very late and left the story very early. So we need to look for somebody who has been as much as possible present from the very moment that the story started until the moment that the story ends. So we have to find a balance between who is most influenced and who has seen most. And those are not always or often not the same person. At the same time, it is also important to not choose a viewpoint character who is a mere bystander who has no involvement with the action itself, because that is also giving a boring story. There has to be movement also from the side of the viewpoint character. And in nonfiction, you cannot make up anything, of course. So you cannot say, you know what, I'll have this person do some stuff that is interesting just because that makes for a more interesting viewpoint character. And at the same time, the one who's most influenced, you cannot give that person a bigger role than he's actually playing. Some narrative nonfiction writers are of the opinion that you can merge characters and so, and in that way sort of invent certain details and twist certain details for the sake of the story, but those practices are highly controversial. And you should really read into the subject before you make a decision like that. So, at some point you will have chosen a viewpoint character who's going to become your protagonist, your main character. And now it's important to choose in what person you're going to write your story. I guess this is nothing new for anybody, but you have the first, the second, and the third person. And I will talk them over briefly, just to be certain. In the first person, you describe your own journey from the I person, from the I perspective. And you can also write like that, not from your own experiences, but from the experience of your viewpoint character. And then you sort of become the viewpoint character. So every time you write the word I, you mean the character that you're writing about. So you can have two functions for the first person, and that is either describing your own journey. You are the journalist and you are explaining or telling the story as you have discovered it, basically. Or you become your viewpoint character and you write about somebody else's life as though it is your own. And the second person is all about you. And actually the most useful place for the second person is in how-tos, You take that screw and then you put it into that piece of wood, An instruction manual works very well with you. And things like cookbooks and do-it-yourself manuals and that sort of stuff. And then there's the third person point of view. And then you're talking about other people. So that is the he, she, and they point of view. And this is very versatile because you can actually for every scene use another viewpoint character, although you should always keep that to a minimum. But you can, in principle, without really a big shift, go from viewpoint character to viewpoint character. And this brings me to another element, and that is the omniscient point of view, which is most of the time third person. And that is that you are writing in the third person, but you know everything that is going on everywhere. So you are omniscient, you know everything. So that means that you can write in one scene about a character in, let's say, New York City, and then in the next scene you can say something about a character in Seattle at the same time. You know all these things because you're not limited to the viewpoint of one particular character. You can jump through space and time, basically. In narrative nonfiction, you can actually also combine the first person with a form of omniscient point of view. For example, the writer tells his own journey of discovery as sort of an investigative journalist or something like that, and they can tell things about their own journey at that moment, and they can also just as easily skip through other parts of the world explaining things that were happening simultaneously. And that then, if that continues in a narrative, also needs its own sort of viewpoint character. They skip from the first person then to a third person to tell something about somebody else going through a certain experience somewhere else in the world or somewhere else in time. And then just segue back to their own first person narrative. In this case, the writer is sort of an omniscient narrator speaking from his or her own experiences, but knowing way, way, way more than what they saw happening in front of their eyes. So whereas in fiction, as much as possible, you stay with this one viewpoint character and you describe only what this particular viewpoint character can see and hear and understand. In nonfiction and narrative nonfiction, you are actually way freer to zoom out and take this omniscient point of view without the reader having the feeling that you're tricking them or so, or that you're jumping out of point of view. The point is that you always need to be very deliberate with these things. And you need to know a lot for this. Let's say if you write a travel journal or something like that, you just write whatever you see and whatever you learn on the spot, and you publish those as blogs or something like that. You don't need so much knowledge for that. You can just write what you see and experience and what you hear. But if you want to do the same thing, but more with an omniscient point of view, you need way more knowledge about everything, basically, to provide this broader context. So what this demands, this first omniscient point of view, let's call it that, is deep research. You need to make sure that you know a whole lot. It probably involves a lot of interviewing, a lot of reading and studying, etc. But it does make for very interesting books, this kind of nonfiction. I remember reading, what is it? I need to look at my bookshelf. Surviving Gallerus, that is it, or Gallerus. I don't really know how to pronounce that. I'll get it for a moment. Okay, there it is. It's the experience of Stanley Williams as a volcano researcher and written by Van Montaigne. And he is a very talented writer. He tells the story of Stanley Williams, in this case as sort of a collaboration. And he's writing all the active scenes and all the narrative about himself, about Stanley Williams, in the first person. But very often it takes off on excursions through volcano research and all those kinds of things. And histories, the history of the first recorded volcano eruptions and that sort of thing. And that then more in a third person. That turns sometimes a bit more into exposition in part, but sometimes also just scenic narrative from history. So it is a very interesting, a very engaging way of telling a story. That's why I love this book so much. And it also really has a beautiful story arc, I think. So Surviving Gallerus, I really don't know how to pronounce that. Gallerus, I think. If you want to study narrative nonfiction, I think this is really something to recommend. Okay, let's put it back. And I'm not going to cut these parts out because I like the idea of just inviting you into my study. I turn the microphone on and we're having a conversation together here. Take another sip of coffee and check what else I wanted to say. Okay, yeah, one thing, of course, I want to say, I always want to make at least one mention of this. I have an email list and I would love it if you subscribe to it. If you go to yourbeststory.net, yourbeststory.net, you will find a subscription form for my email list. And then every week I send you an email with valuable tips, with inspiration, with quick tips, with whatever I can come up with that helps you. And you get updated about the podcast and you get updated about all kinds of other things. And you also will, of course, receive the magazine into your mailbox. Obviously, if you've been listening so far, you are interested in what I have to say. So it would be great if you would join my email list as well. Thank you. Okay, let's continue. We spoke earlier about choosing your point of view character and that you need to go for the person who has seen most of it and find a good balance between who has experienced most of the story. So that is a fine balance sometimes, but it is in the case of narrative nonfiction usually the best to go for the one who has seen most of the story. But it is obviously most of the times impossible to tell everything through his eyes. If you install the GoPro right beside his eyes, sort of attach it to his glasses or something like that, and you don't ever take that GoPro off his glasses to take another stance, then you are necessarily going to miss important information. So you're going to have to leave your viewpoint character behind in most of the stories some of the time. So you make sure that you can disconnect the GoPro from your viewpoint character and go to other places from where you can see certain parts of the story better. It could be that in our fighting scene, the viewpoint character saw certain things happening between these two groups of people, but he was standing too far away to actually see the people hitting each other and see that part of the story where this one guy got such a beating that he needed to go to the hospital, for example. In that case, you actually want to disconnect this GoPro from the glasses of your viewpoint character and take it along to the fight and make some shots closer up. You want to zoom in to what is happening because your viewpoint character is just not always the best place to look from. Sometimes you cannot have a clear vision that way. Sometimes it's not the most effective, not the most engaging stance to look at the story from. So you need to be more mobile with your camera. So the stance that you take is where do you put your camera at any given moment in the story. And with every detail that you point out, you're actually moving the camera to another place. For example, you want to zoom in on a couple of knuckles that are bloodied from just breaking somebody's nose. Then you're actually taking the camera momentarily and putting it very close to the hands of this person. And you might then want to tell something about the broken nose. So the stance of the camera is moving again a little bit. The camera is following the action in that way. So that's the stance. Where have you put your camera? And in many cases, you sort of have, just in normal videography, you will have a stance from a distance, and from there you zoom in and out again, and zoom in and out again, etc. So be very deliberate about that. Where are you going to see everything from your viewpoint character? Is your viewpoint character always going to be the stance? Or are you going to take that camera and put it someplace else to have a better view of your scene? You become like a film director. But only you have, as I just mentioned, more senses. You can use touch, feeling. You can feel the wind. You can smell the snack bar. Or the vomit, or whatever. You know, actually, when I speak these words, snack bar or vomit, what happens in your brain is that certain areas light up that are associated with those smells. So that is a very powerful weapon to use. In that sense, you are a film director who has way more power over the experience of the reader. But it is very important to be just as deliberate with all that stuff as a film director is with the stance of the camera. So don't just do something. Always be aware of where is that camera standing. So by zooming in and out, you determine the distance in stances between the scene and the reader. The camera is the distance from which the reader is looking, of course. So the further away that is, the greater the distance is between the reader and what is happening. Another kind of distance is more the abstract one. You zoom out from the scene and take more a stance in abstract reality. Or you zoom out to look more at the data. For example, you zoom out of the fighting scene and you go into the metrics and the statistics on how many people are being arrested for street fighting every year, for example. That is a way more abstract thing. You zoom out away from the scene and start looking at data instead of the stuff that is happening on the ground. So that is another kind of distance. So zooming in makes the details more clear, zooming out makes the whole context more clear and also more the abstract context. Another important question, and in this case I'm going to conclude with this. This is the last important question that you have to ask yourself in this sequence, is where are you? So you have to decide on where the camera is going to be, but just important is the question, where are you going to be relative to the camera? If you're standing behind the camera, that means that you're trying to be as objective as you possibly can be, really show the scenes unadorned and uninterpreted as much as possible, as objective as possible, portray what actually happened without any kind of interference from you. Of course, it is a question whether that is really possible, because even the choice of stance is determined by your preconceived ideas, by your beliefs, by your biases. So it is hardly possible, I think, to even from a position behind the camera to be fully objective. But this is at least the kind of voice, the kind of writing that tries to be objective, to show everything that is happening as it is happening, so that the reader, him or herself, can draw conclusions for themselves. But you can also decide to stand sort of half next to the camera, half before, a little bit so that so that the viewer can maybe see the edge of your earlobe or so, or just a little brush of hair or part of the shoulder. You're not entirely out of the view of your reader. Well, this position relative to the camera, to your stand, you achieve by showing through your choice of words here and there what you are thinking about the subject, what your interpretation of it is. Only very subtly your ideas, your slant, your opinions shine through just in how you are framing the stuff you're seeing. But you're still not really visible. You are not visible as a person, rather your opinions shine through a little bit. You can also stand right in front of the camera. This happens when you are actually part of the story. You are the I person who is telling the story, who is standing in front of the camera, explaining what happens behind you and being part of the interactions on the screen, basically. Something similar happens in The Great Gatsby. This is an example that is often cited. It is also the best example that I know. The viewpoint character, the narrator in the first person, is a guy called Nick. And he is telling about a person who is intriguing to him, Mr. Gatsby, and the mysteries around this person. So the story is a very interesting story. I cannot really recall so much of it because it has been a while since I read it. I should actually read it again because it was a good story. But the thing is, you experience the entire story from another person than the viewpoint character. Or actually from the protagonist. And you could say that he was like a journalist reporting on the life of Mr. Gatsby. But even if you are not really part of the story, if you are really obviously framing your opinions and your point of view in the more expositional sense of the word, as we just spoke about, shines through very strongly, then you are also in a way standing in front of the camera. So this is another kind of distance that we're talking about here. This is not to do with the distance from your reader to the subject. This has more to do with the distance between the writer and the story. Is the writer, him or herself, just a bystander telling about what has happened, or actually part of the story, or really invested in the story in such a way that they really want to put their own stamp on it, their own interpretation? And actually, I think it's good to mention another kind of closeness still. Also in how you approach your characters, or how you write about the characters. You can either be super close to your character or further away from your character. If you are very close to your viewpoint character and you write about that person, you begin to adopt some of their vocabulary, some of the words that they use when they are thinking. This, of course, demands really a lot of interviewing and asking them, hey, what are you thinking in a moment like that? And what were you thinking in that particular moment? And there are ways of helping people remember. But if you have all that information as to how people were thinking at a certain moment, you can start using those words in your narrative as you are describing what is happening. So your words are no longer fully your own, but you begin to share the words that you're using for your story with the words of the viewpoint character. This is sort of a close third person that you can also employ in narrative nonfiction. I remember that James Wood had an example of this in fiction then. And it was something like, through foolish tears, he was looking at the orchestra. Something like that. And he asked the question, was it the writer who felt that these tears were foolish? Well, probably not, because if you see a symphony of Brahms or whatever it was, now that can be such a deeply emotional feeling, such an emotional experience that you just feel the tears come up, that just happens. And I don't think the writer would say, well, that is foolish. But the writer might have asked the person this was about, like, what were you feeling when these tears come up? And I felt completely foolish, I was just crying, it was just a concert, and where did those tears come from? And then the writer can say, through foolish tears, he was looking at the orchestra. And then immediately, that so helps understand the picture of that scene. when you get into the head of the viewpoint character, even only by using one word that is typical for this person to think at that moment. So also the distance between the writer, and therefore the reader, and the character's world of thought and emotions can be big. You can talk about persons as almost as though they are robots, or very small, that basically the writer turns for a moment, only for the length of a word, into the viewpoint character. And that creates a way more emotional connection. By the way, the book that I was referencing here was James Wood, How Fiction Works. A very interesting book on, well, basically everything having to do with fiction. And if you want to be a narrative nonfiction writer, the best books to read are books on fiction techniques. And then you can start figuring out in your own work how you can employ these fiction techniques into your nonfiction without turning into a liar. You, as a nonfiction writer, need to tell the truth. So, a very short recap. You need to choose your point of view character, trying to find a balance between the one who has seen the most of the story and the one who is most influenced by it. Once you've found that, you decide on the first, second, and third person, and you can expand the first and the third person with omniscience, turning them into omniscience point of view. That demands deep research. And in doing so, you need to decide on stances. Where are you going to put the camera? Or are you going to stick to your point of view character? Most of the time, you need to strike a good balance between those things. We spoke about distance. How close to the action is your camera gonna be, or how far away? And whether you are going to zoom out enough to actually look at abstract information such as statistics and that sort of thing, or historical overviews, or you name it. And you need to see, lastly, where you are standing relative to the camera position that you chose. Okay, I hope you've learned something from this podcast. I poured a lot of my knowledge over your heads right now. I hope I did so in an understandable manner. If there are any questions left about this, feel free to ask them. Either send me an email or contact me via my website or place a comment. Again, join my email list if you would like to get advice from me and ideas and everything every week into your email box. And I wish you a lot of writing inspiration, and God bless you on your writing journey. Bye-bye.